make it possible to, take a look at iNaturalist really quickly. I don't know how many of you are using iNaturalist. It's a really good resource for learning about natural history and for contributing to the Martha's Vineyard Atlas of Life, because part of what we do is glean records from the vineyard off of iNaturalist. So anything you post from the vineyard ends up in the Atlas of Life. But I wanted to look very quickly at our Atlas of Life project here. You can see we're almost up to 10,000 observations, well over 2,000 species. That's happened quickly. I just wanted to show you, this is the array of Orthoptera observations. You can see we've got more than 300 observations of just Orthoptera. That's crickets and katydids and grasshoppers, and 46 species represented, which is pretty good. There are only about 60 species that are known from the vineyard, and some of those are historical ones. So this iNaturalist thing is building to the point where it actually has pretty significant information in it. And I wanted to call our attention to one particular observation, if I can find it here. Yes, this one. Ecanthus lactanus, or tree cricket. And interesting looking tree cricket, very recognizable with the sort of strawberry markings on the head that extend out onto the antenna. What was interesting about this particular record was that it was the first record for the vineyard. You know, I've been looking for Orthoptera for 12 years, and I've never seen this species, and people have done Orthoptera work here in the past and had never seen this species. So a relatively casual observer with no particular interest in Orthoptera was out there with his camera and came across a very significant record. And I just like to use this as an example, this kind of thing as an example of the fact that anybody can make a significant contribution. You don't have to be particularly skilled these days. All you have to do is make the effort to pay attention to what's going on around you and to upload information or let somebody know. I mean, uploading it into iNaturalist is one way to let people know what you're seeing, but simply calling me or emailing me and telling me you saw something that you don't know what is also works. So I encourage you to get started and be bold about using iNaturalist. It works pretty well. It's a lot of fun. And I think that's all we're going to do on iNaturalist. So I'm going to bail out of that and switch over to the PowerPoint that I prepared here. Okay, very quickly, most of you know that I'm the director of Martha's Vineyard Atlas of Life. I work for Biodiversity Works. The Atlas is an attempt to compile the most complete records possible on the vineyard's distinctive biodiversity. And in so doing, we also hope to enlist a lot of people as contributors to the project, helping us out. So one of the goals, a sort of ancillary goal, is to promote interest and pride, I would even say, in the vineyard's biodiversity. And one of the things that I'm doing to hopefully make that come to fruition is spending a little bit of time teaching people skills and taking them out into the field and showing them how to find and study things. And Orthoptera is a relatively new interest for me, and I like to tell the story of how I got started paying attention to this particular group. I was out in the middle of February one day, this is about 11 or 12 years ago, And as gardeners tend to do, I was sort of planning the spring campaign, and I was thinking about how I was going to prune some blueberry bushes. But I was on the south side of our house, and as I was poking around there in the vegetation that was right up against the foundation of our house, I noticed these little green grasshoppers like this one on the screen hopping around. And I was flabbergasted. I mean, grasshoppers in February, who would have thought of such a thing? So I needed to figure out what was going on with the grasshoppers in February. And I began doing some research, and over the next couple of years sort of clarified a project that I was going to be doing a checklist of Vineyard Orthoptera and do as much research on historical sources as I could and do as much field work as I could. So I will explain what this grasshopper turned out to be a little bit later on in the presentation, but I just wanted to let you know that there are in fact grasshoppers that can be found in every month of the year on Martha's Vineyard. And so it's a full year sport chasing these little devils around. We all probably have a pretty good sense of what I'm talking about with crickets and katydids and grasshoppers. It's an order. Orthoptera is the order of level of taxonomy, so it's the same thing as Lepidoptera and Coleoptera, which are the beetles. Lepidoptera are moths and butterflies. It's at that high level of taxonomic structure. Generally speaking, Orthoptera are adapted for jumping. Some of them also fly perfectly well, but even the ones that can't fly can jump many times their own body length with specially modified hind legs. That makes it pretty easy to recognize an orthopteran when you see one. In contrast to something like flies that undergo complete metamorphosis, in other words, you have a maggot that looks nothing at all like an adult fly, and it pupates, and out of that comes the adult fly. Orthoptera engage in partial metamorphosis, meaning that the immature forms basically resemble adults in structure. They do change a little bit as they grow, but as soon as they come out of the eggs, they're recognizably Orthoptera with those big hoppy type hind legs. Generally, because as large insects, they generally have just one generation per year. And that's important because it limits how far north a particular species can occur. The growing season has to be long enough in general for the full life cycle to take place. And if it isn't long enough, then you won't find that particular species at that latitude. So that one generation per year thing is a really important thing. Somebody maybe could mute themselves there. I'm not sure what that noise was, but I don't think it was at this end. With a few exceptions, all of our Orthoptera overwinter as eggs. So the adults reach maturity in August and September, and they lay eggs in any of a variety of settings. And those eggs overwinter and then hatch in spring sometime. And then they go through a series of 6 molts until they reach their adult stage, and then they mate and start the process all over again. There are a few grasshoppers and a few crickets that overwinter as nymphs or as immatures. And that was what I found on that day in February with the nymphs of a particular species of grasshopper. And they don't really hibernate. They sort of get dormant when the weather is cold, but when it warms up enough, they will become active and they'll do a little bit of feeding and sometimes even molt during the winter. But that's definitely the exception rather than the rule with Orthoptera. And then finally, most Orthoptera, not most, I would say a high percentage of Orthoptera have evolved a mechanism for producing sound. In the case of crickets and katydids, which are closely related and kind of distinct from the grasshoppers. They have roughened surfaces at the base of the wings that they rub together. In some grasshoppers, there are little pegs on the inside of the hind femora or thighs that they rub against a roughened spot on the wings to produce the scraping sound. And then a good number of grasshoppers do what's known as crepitating, which is banging their wings together in flight. It makes a sort of slapping or buzzing sound. And they do that as a warning sign to others when they're alarmed. They do it to attract mates. They do it maybe to stake out a territory. So very sonically oriented as in terms of insects. Sound is very important to Orthoptera. The diversity on the vineyard is pretty good. We're up to about 60 species. Of those, a number haven't been recorded for many years. They're probably extirpated. I would say we probably have somewhere between 50 and 52 species that occur regularly on the vineyard now, or are resident on the vineyard. Spread between these various families. These are basically the family level division that we've got here. So that's a pretty high diversity, but it's not overwhelming. It's not like moths where we have thousands of species. With a little bit of application, it's really possible to learn grasshoppers and katydids and crickets. And if there's one message I want you to take away from the presentation tonight, it's that this is a manageable body of biodiversity. You can get on top of this reasonably quickly. I want to say a few words in general about identification. And first and foremost is the fact that for a lot of things, it's much easier to identify them by sound than by sight. They are, in general, these insects are extremely good at hiding. And you can spend a long time searching even for one that's making noise and not be able to get a decent look at it. But they all have distinctive sounds. It's like bird calls and bird songs. That's how the Orthoptera sort themselves out. So if it works for them, then if we learn their songs, we can sort them out the same way. What matters in terms of important details varies pretty widely from group to group. But in general, the appendages, male and female sexual appendages at the end of the abdomen are important. So if you're photographing and you want to identify something, that's a piece of anatomy that you want to do your very best to get clear images of. With grasshoppers, there are some other pieces of the anatomy that are helpful. We don't really need to get into that. Again, I urge you to use iNaturalist. I have my iNat account set up so that all of the Orthoptera posted from Massachusetts end up in my feed. And there is a guy named Brandon Wu, who is a graduate student at Cornell, who is fantastic at Orthoptera identification. And he identifies pretty much everything that turns up from New England. So this is a group where you'll get a lot of help very quickly in iNaturalist. And finally, color is less helpful than you think it's going to be. I often find, when I was starting to learn about grasshoppers, to find a really strikingly colored grasshopper and think, oh, this is going to be a snap to identify. It's this bright red grasshopper. And then it turns out that all sorts of grasshoppers have reddish morphs like that, and it was no help at all. So you need to focus on structure primarily. There are a few exceptions to that. In grasshoppers, for example, the color of the wings, which they show in flight, and the color of their hind tibia, the shin bone, in effect, can be very important for identification. So in terms of finding them, they're open country insects. You find them on edges. There aren't many that will occur in under full canopy in a forest. Some species are wetland associates, and some do better in dry habitat. So if you want to find all of our Orthoptera, you need to cover some ground and you need to check out some different habitats. A few species have very, very strong habitat associations, but in general, this is pretty much a group of generalists. They tend to occur in a wide range of habitats pretty much indiscriminately. They're usually very well camouflaged and spending their time hidden. And so in order to find them, you either have to zero in on something that's making noise, or do what I do and just sort of move slowly through habitat, keeping your eyes down and having a sort of search image in your mind of small hopping insects. And when something jumps, watch where it lands and approach it more carefully. And you can usually get pretty close to them. They're fairly tolerant of disturbance if you move slowly and respectfully. So we're going to look first at the grasshoppers, and the family name is Acrididae, shorthorn grasshoppers, and the shorthorn part there refers to their antennae. And basically the difference between grasshoppers on one hand and crickets and katydids on the other is that the grasshoppers have fairly short antennae, and the crickets and katydids have very, very long whip-like, very thread-like antennae that are usually longer than the body of the insect. So you can make the first taxonomic cut sort of by looking at the antenna and determine whether you or not you've got a grasshopper. We have 4 species of shorthorn grasshoppers. One, that bird grasshopper is probably extirpated, but it could turn up here because they're able to fly. Some of the bandwing grasshoppers are extirpated, but we probably have about 7 or 8 species. And the other numbers look about right to me in terms of the number of species that we've got. I mentioned that color is not particularly helpful with bandwing grasshoppers, and this is a slide to drive that point home. We have 4 different species represented here in 3 different genera, and they all are pretty much alike. You know, there are differences, but they basically share the same body form, and they share a fairly similar structure. So in order to identify them, we have to look at something more than just their gross overall morphology and the color of the body parts that are immediately obvious. A lot of bandwing grasshoppers are very, very well camouflaged. This one is Trimeratropus maritima, and you will find this exclusively. It is one that has a very strong habitat association. You'll find it exclusively in dune grass habitat on beaches and back dunes. I've never found one more than about 100 yards away from that setting. The species as a whole occurs all the way out into Nebraska. So it's not, you know, the species name maritima is not exactly accurate. But wherever it occurs, it shows up essentially on bare sand, and its markings evolve on a local scale to match the substrate pretty closely. So you see that this guy blends in very well to our vineyard style sand. If we were looking at gravelly substrate out in Illinois somewhere on a lake front in Illinois, it would be a very different set of markings, but it would still be the same species. It's pretty much the only grasshopper you're going to see in that setting. When they fly, they show yellowish wings and they crepitate. And if you see a grasshopper that does that in that setting, you know what it is. Here's another bare ground grasshopper. This is Cnidia fenestralis. It's again one that is found mostly on barren ground or very sparse vegetation, and evolves local adaptation to the substrates with really good protective coloration. One field mark is the very, very long antenna by grasshopper standards for this species. They also have a sort of heads-up alert posture that is actually pretty distinctive. And they're rather scarce on the vineyard. I've only found them a couple of places. One is at Trade Winds in Oak Bluffs, and the other is in the eastern portion of the state forest. I noticed on iNaturalist that somebody found one along the beach road the other day, though, so there are other populations out there waiting to be found. One of our most common bandwing grasshoppers, in fact, the most common bandwing grasshopper, is Dicystera carolina, or the Carolina grasshopper. You've undoubtedly seen these. They're big grasshoppers, and they fly. When they fly, they show a black wing with a yellow band on it. We'll look at a slide that shows that in a second. But one characteristic of this particular grasshopper is this notch. This body structure here is called the pronotum. It's basically a shield of exoskeleton that covers the thorax of the insect. So the wings originate and the legs originate under the pronotum pretty much. And most bandwing grasshoppers have an elevated keel along the top of their pronotum, like this one shows. The shape of that keel will vary. On some of them, it's just, it's mostly flat, but there'll be one little short keel. In others, it's notched like this. In others, it's not notched. So it's, again, it's a really important piece of the anatomy to identify a bandwing grasshopper. You want to get good photos of this if this is what you're dealing with. But this particular grasshopper has this very, very strong notch here. It looks like you could use it as a can opener or a bottle opener. It's very wide. It's got a kind of hooked, you can almost see there's a little hook there. So that's a very distinctive feature on this grasshopper that will distinguish it from a number of very similar species. They also have, as I mentioned, the black wing with a pale margin, and that's totally distinctive. There is nothing even closely resembling that around here. So if you see this grasshopper in flight, you'll recognize it instantly. There's no mistaking it. Cortophaga viridifasciata, one of the common names, and I'm going to be using mostly scientific names because common names are just, with grasshoppers, are just not very well standardized. So if you call it by a common name, it often is ambiguous. But where they have common names, I'll try to give you those too. And this one is called the northern green-striped grasshopper, probably because of this green stripe here on the side of the wing. I'm not sure. It also has a pretty strong keel on its pronotum, but instead of having that really strong notch like the Carolina grasshopper has, it's got just a very narrow single slit right about in the middle of it. So that helps recognize it. This is the grasshopper that I found the nymphs of in February. This is what the adults look like. And it's one of only 2 grasshoppers on the vineyard that overwinters as a nymph. So it's kind of unusual. Very, very common grasshopper. We start getting adults about the middle of April, and they hang on until about the middle of August. And there will be a while actually where the ones from the adults from last year will be overlapping with the nymphs from this year very briefly. One characteristic of Cortophaga, though, is that it's highly variable in terms of coloration. Remember I said don't rely on color? Well, this green one is a very distinctive looking grasshopper, but this is the same species. And that's the same species. So you need to look at structure again. The color is not going to be very helpful. In general, females are this green morph, and males are this brown morph, and the females are going to be substantially larger. They'll be well over an inch long, while the males will be about an inch long. So you can determine the sex most of the time in the field very readily, but you can't go by color to identify these grasshoppers. They crepitate in flight. They go brrr when they take off, and they have a clear wing, which is pretty evident when they're flying. We're moving on now. I didn't cover all of the bandwing grasshoppers because we need to get through this tonight. But I do want to move on to the next subfamily, which is called Gomphocerinae, or the slant-faced grasshoppers. And that's a common name that makes pretty good sense. If you see how on these grasshoppers, the front of the face recedes backwards, and the head has kind of a high peaked shape to it. So that's a characteristic of this entire subfamily, and I think we have 4 or 5 members of it on the vineyard. You get so you can recognize the shape. And in general, also, slant-faced grasshoppers have narrower wings than the bandwing grasshoppers do. It's not that really broad wing that we saw on the Carolina grasshopper and some of the other ones that we looked at. But again, color is not going to be very helpful. These are 4 examples of the same species. In fact, these are 4 examples of the same species taken within about 50 feet of each other in the space of 5 minutes. So you can see how variable they are. There just is no relying on color. But one feature that is pretty consistent about this particular grasshopper is this marking that you see on the top of the pronotum. It's like there's a little black wedge on the back half of the pronotum. And you see that all of these individuals show that to some degree. So that is a helpful field mark. And There are also details of the what are called sulci or sulci. They're little grooves that run across the pronotum, and the best way to demonstrate that is to look at a close relative. So that's Orthoptera pallidna, and this is Orthoptera speciosa in the same genus, very closely related. Note, first of all, that the wings are longer on pallidna, extending beyond the edge of the abdomen, end of the abdomen, and they're shorter on speciosa. So that's one good field mark. But the other is if you look on the pronotum here, and you see this groove or crack, that's a sulcus, and there is only one of them that cuts this corner of the pronotum on speciosa. And if I had an equally good picture of pallidna, the other species, there would be a second little cut, just like that, visible right about there on the pronotum. So I apologize for getting a little nerdy on you. This is really a delicate anatomical detail, and to get really good at grasshoppers, you do have to get comfortable looking at them in that level of detail. But at the same time, I'd say, you know, this is a trick, and once you know that trick, you can look at these grasshoppers, you can get it to genus pretty readily because they both got this black wedge here. And with a good picture, if you know that little gimmick, that it's got one slice instead of two, it actually is possible to learn this stuff pretty readily. So don't be deterred by the level of detail here. It's just, it just needs a little bit of learning, but it is very, very learnable. It can be done. This is another one of our slant-faced grasshoppers. Again, you can recognize it by the peaked head and the receding face line. A good characteristic of this one is both males and females tend to have a lot of black on the side of the pronotum. This is called Chloialtis conspersa, or the sprinkled grasshopper. Relatively uncommon on the vineyard. I find it along the fire lanes in the state forest, but I usually only find one or two individuals at a time, and I always consider it to be a pretty good find. All right, we're on to the next group of grasshoppers here, the subfamily, the so-called spur-throated grasshoppers. And I promised to get a good picture of this at some point, but if you were to turn one of these guys over and look at the underside of its thorax, right between its front legs, it's got a weird little pyramid sticking out. And nobody knows what it's there for, but it's why the whole subfamily has it. And that's why the subfamily got the common name spur-throated grasshoppers, because they have that ridiculous little spur roughly where their throat is. Again, be wary of color. These are 4 examples of the same species, pretty dramatically different. They do have some similarities. They have this black patch here. The banding on the hind leg is muted, some other similarities. But you can't really go on color with these things. Melanopolis femorubrum, or the red-legged grasshopper, is probably our most common grasshopper. They are all over the place. They're just starting to reach maturity now. It's a relatively late season species. And you can see thousands of these in a day if you walk through an old pasture. They're just jumping and jumping and jumping with every step you take. Very, very common species. You might say that this one looks pretty similar, and you'd be right. Melanopolis, the genus Melanopolis, is an absolute bear. It's got something like 220 members in it. And while a few of them are really distinctive, a lot of them are not. You can see it's got the same. This one has sort of like that black spot there. This one has a similar black marking, and a lot of things are similar. So this is actually a difficult genus to identify in some cases. And the real critical thing for distinguishing Melanopolis is this little structure back here on a male Melanopolis. It's a piece of anatomy called the cercus, C-E-R-C-U-S. And every species of Melanopolis, the males have a distinctively shaped circus. Here you may be able to see that it's kind of shaped like a mitten with a broad part and then a little spur under it. So that's pretty distinctive. And that's how I know that this is Melanopolis keeleri, or Keeler's grasshopper, spur-throated grasshopper. I now can recognize Melanopolis keeleri just by where it is and how it behaves and what the date is and how it looks. But the way that I got to that point was by identifying a bunch with absolute certainty by this field mark and learning to recognize them that way. So that's kind of how you have to go at it with a lot of the Melanopolis. Remember what this guy looks like, and then think about this one. It's a pretty similar grasshopper, except the wings are shorter and the circus is different. Again, as I was saying, it's got this little kind of compressed, indented area at the end. It doesn't have the mitten shape. It's longer and more prominent. So we know that this is a different species. And the wing is shorter too, which is a helpful field mark. So this is actually Melanopolis fasciatus, or the huckleberry spur-throated grasshopper. This is a male. This is a female. And females generally are bigger in grasshoppers and have a longer abdomen to contain their egg-producing apparatus. This is also a very common early season grasshopper on the vineyard. It turns up in a lot of dry wooded habitats, semi-wooded habitats. But again, it's pretty difficult to identify unless you have experience with it or unless you find a male and can get a look at that little circus on it. Much easier is a grasshopper like Melanopolis bivitatus, or the two-striped grasshopper. These come in brown and yellow and pink variants, but they all have these strong lines that start up at the front of the head and run along the pronotum and continue down the wings. So this is one that you can identify easily in the field without any magnification. You just need a good look at it and you'll know immediately what it is. Nothing that resembles it. And then here's another one that's pretty easy to recognize, differential grasshopper, Melanopolis differentialis. And the field mark here that is key is this very bold chevron marking on the outside of the femur or the hind thigh. Interesting history of this grasshopper on the vineyard. It seems to be associated entirely with agricultural and horticultural settings. The first record, which Nancy Weaver found, was about 10 years ago at Mermaid Farm on some row crops. A few years back, I found a zillion of them on chrysanthemums, which is where I photographed this one, in nurseries all around the island. They clearly got imported on chrysanthemums from someplace that off island where they were growing chrysanthemums and had this grasshopper. I found them on the ornamental plantings on Ocean Park in Oak Bluffs. And now there is what appears to be a pretty robust established population at Thimble Farm. And again, it was probably brought in on some kind of agricultural material, and it liked what it found and it set up shop. And now it seems to be established, at least locally, on the vineyard. But I like to give this as an example because the fauna, the Orthoptera fauna here is not static. It is changing. We are losing species and we are gaining species. This is an example of one we're in the process of gaining. And that's one of the reasons I want to get other people looking out there for grasshoppers and other Orthoptera. We need more eyes out there to detect these things as they start to happen. There are a number of species that I'm expecting to show up here sort of any day now. And I might be the one to find it, but you might be the one to find it. And the more people we have looking, the better. Very briefly, the family Tetragydii, or pygmy grasshoppers, is very poorly represented on the vineyard. We only have one species. And the characteristic of most of the tetragyds is that pronotum, which remember was usually just on this area of a bandwing grasshopper, is elongated, so it extends the full length of the grasshopper on a tetragyd. and there are wings hidden under there. Some of these things can actually fly, but for whatever reason, this has evolved as a characteristic of the family. We only have this one species, the crested pygmy grasshopper, or Nomatetics cristatus. Again, highly variable. These are about the size, these are tiny. They're less than ½ inch long. They're about the size of a dried white bean in your pantry. So finding them is a challenge. Photographing them is difficult. But they're fairly common in their preferred habitat. I find them along the fire lanes in the state forest. And one other interesting note about this grasshopper is that it is our only grasshopper of any kind that overwinters as an adult. So right as early as the middle of March or late March, I start finding adults of this species out there in the state forest. And they probably mate during April, and then they all kind of disperse to lay eggs, probably out in the leaf litter. They're fiendishly difficult to study, as you would imagine. Nobody really seems to know much about their field biology, you know, their life histories. But again, a fairly common and very interesting grasshopper. And probably on a size-weighted basis, these are the best jumpers in all of grasshopper-dom. They take off like little artillery shells. It's amazing how far they can jump. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the crickets. And remember, I mentioned that the way you tell crickets and katydids from grasshoppers is that the crickets and katydids have these long whip-like antennae. And they break out into several subfamilies. You don't really need to know the taxonomy, but it's helpful to just sort of be aware of that as background. Field crickets are very, very common. We have 2 species, possibly more, but one of them is active in the fall, and one of them is active in the spring. They don't really overlap, and that's really what distinguishes them. They sound exactly alike. They look exactly alike. And this is the spring field cricket. I think this is spring field cricket. Pennsylvania, it's a fall field cricket. You see, you can't even tell them apart by appearance. This is the one that turns up in your basement going crick, 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 crick all fall long. And we get them from about early August into even into November sometimes. The spring field cricket is one of the few species that overwinters as a nymph. And they start to mature in May sometime, and they're active through about the 3rd week in July. So there is a period during the summer when neither of these species is active as an adult, or if they're only sparingly so. And you don't hear that call, and then all of a sudden it starts up again with a second species making the noise. Interesting bit of biology. I've experimented a little bit with using sound analysis as a way to identify Orthoptera, and this is just one little experiment that I did. I downloaded here in the bottom a sound clip from a website called Singing Insects of North America, which is a great resource, and I'll talk about it at the end of the talk very briefly. And then I went out with a little recording device, and I recorded a cricket in my yard that I knew was the same species. And I used some software to produce what's called a sonogram, or a visual representation of the frequencies of the sound. And you can see that there is a very strong similarity. I had a better recording device, evidently, because I caught this high-pitched overtone that the singing insects in North America didn't have. But otherwise, there are a couple of the fundamental tone and 2 overtones at roughly the same species. The calls occur at the same frequency. So I think this is a viable way to sort of quantify the normally very subjective process of identifying calling Orthoptera by their calls. We have a number of what are called ground crickets, and they're similar to the field crickets, but they're much smaller. The body length is only about ½ inch long. And we have, I think, about 4 species, and you rarely see them. They are very, very cryptic. really spend all of their time hiding at the base of the vegetation and are very difficult. And I'm not sure what's going to happen when I play a sound clip here, but I hope you'll be able to hear this. I'm not sure how Zoom handles this. So let's hear thumbs up, see thumbs up or thumbs down if you can hear it. Excellent. Yeah, so there is another ground cricket that is very, very closely related to this. And if you think about that call, it kind of sounds like the chirping of one of our field crickets, only accelerated. It's the same kind of chirpy note, but the notes come much closer together in time. And there is, another very closely related member of the genus that sounds like this one, only the chirps are a little bit slower. And really the best way to identify this particular genus is by the sound. I think you can do it with a scientific key, but using a website like Bug Guide, where you only have photographs to go on, I just don't think it's possible. I don't think the state of the knowledge allows us to reliably identify them from photographs at this point to the species level. Tree crickets are another important group of crickets. These are perfectly good crickets, even though they look very different. We have 6 or 7 species that look pretty much like this. Long, elongated crickets that tend to hug closely to vegetation. And they have very different calls. I'll play this one just so we can get a sense for what the group. Okay, this is a very common species. You probably have it in your backyard. They're starting to call that sort of breep, breep. The call lasts a second or two. There are 3 or 4 seconds between the calls. So this is an example of a tree cricket that has what's called a pulsed call, meaning that it's got relatively short bursts of sound with space between them. The other class of tree cricket calls are continuous ones where it just trills for a long, long time without any interruption. And these categories are a little bit shaky because sometimes when a continuous calling tree cricket is just starting to warm up for the night, it just gives little bursts of sound. But basically, you can lump the tree cricket calls into 2 classes, pulsed and continuous. They're not easy to identify from photographs. There are some features that are useful, like how much pink they have on the top of the head and how dark their coloration is. Basically, and then some are distinctive, like Acanthus nigricornis or the black horn tree cricket. Note how the antennae are all black and there's a lot of black on the legs. And remember how sort of woody sounding the call was of that narrow-winged tree cricket that I just played. Well, hear how different this call is. So it's a continuous and kind of ringing metallic quality to its tone quality. This is a common species on the vineyard, but it's pretty restricted to shrub swamps. You hear it if you're along the Great Pond shorelines, or maybe even along freshwater shorelines. But that's where I hear them. I hear them a lot when I'm out canoeing on the Great Ponds. Even like if you know Sepiessa Point, when you drive into the preservation off of New Lane, there's a little bit of shrub swamp on your right. That was the first place I ever heard this species on the vineyard. So there was a little population in there. But pretty recognizable call. They're difficult, like other tree crickets, difficult to get a look at. If you can get an angle like this on a tree cricket, however, those markings at the base of the antenna are distinctive. It isn't helpful with all the species, but of the ones that are confusing, this is the diagnostic field mark. You can see there are 4 spots, quadripunctatus, meaning 4-spotted tree cricket, and that's its common name. So it's not easy to get this angle when you are photographing these in the field. You can sometimes grab it and hold it by its hind legs and manipulate it. You can pop it in a jar and chill it. Or sometimes you just get lucky and you'll catch one with its antennae swept back and you'll be able to get that shot. But in the absence of being able to get that shot, we probably have 3 or 4 species in this genus that you can't reliably identify from a photograph. So we're using sound. And then this is actually also a tree cricket, but a very different, it's in a different genus and obviously quite distinctive in appearance. This is also a very common species that you likely have in your yard, and it's got a pretty distinctive call. To get it fired up here, if I can get Zoom to cooperate. So it's got a much darker and woodier tone quality than our acanthus tree crickets do. And you can recognize it pretty readily with a little bit of practice. I wish I had time to go into the bizarre reproductive habits of this genus, or these 2 genera, or some of their other habits. For example, they sometimes chew a hole in a leaf and stick their head through and use that leaf as sort of a megaphone to amplify the noise that they make when they call. So very, very interesting biologically group of insects. And you will hear these around. Some of them are very, very common insects and occur in settled habitats in people's yards and so forth, as well as out in natural habitats. Here's another one. It took me 10 years to get a look at one of these things. I could hear them calling in my backyard, and I knew they weren't a tree cricket. I knew they weren't a field cricket. I knew they weren't a ground cricket. And they were calling from about 4 feet off the ground in our red cedars, but I could not find one to save my life. They sound like this. Little bursts of sound lasting less than a second and spaced a second or 2 apart. And I had no idea what it was until I went out one day and one of them had come into our porch light. And I recognized it from having studied pictures. And it was called Orthoptera saltator, or jumping bush cricket. And I went to the Singing Insects of North America website and listened to the song. It was like, that's it! A 10-year mystery solved serendipitously by one showing up under my porch light. This is another very, very common orthopteran, and it seems to be more common in settled areas than out in the woods. So listen for it. They're a late season species, usually starting up about the end of August, and you're very likely to hear it. And I should add, while I'm thinking of it, I am recording this meeting, and we will put the meeting up on our Atlas of Life website, so you can go back and refresh your memory at some point. I don't know when we're going to get that done, but you will be able to refresh your memory a little bit. Okay, so on to the katydids, which are one of my, well, they're all my favorite group. What am I saying? We're going to have to move along here pretty quickly because, as usual, I'm talking more than I should have been. But basically, katydids are green. They're like green crickets with often with long wings. The appendages at the end of the abdomen are really important for identifying these, more so in some genera than in others. But among our false katydids, we have 3 species, I guess. These appendages are really critical. Scuderia furcata, or the fork-tailed bush katydid. The female ovipositor is red, and the male has this wonderful piece of apparatus. This is called a supraanal plate, and it is fork-shaped, which is how the furcata, Scuderia, fork-tailed bush cricket got its name. So you can catch these guys pretty readily. You can hold them by their wings and get a picture of your cell phone of their naughty bits, and that will really help with the identification. Amblycarifa, or the round-headed katydids. I think we have 2 species here, but they're pretty much impossible to ID from photographs. These can only be done to species from sound. But note how long the wings are on this individual, and compare it to the very short wings on this remarkable pink one that Bert Fisher photographed out in Aquina a few years ago. I'm pretty sure this is so-called round-winged rotundifolia, and the other one was oblongifolia, or the oblong-winged katydid. But really, the sound is the only way to tell these guys apart. And then Microcentrum, another species that appears to have just gotten established on the Vineyard recently, and it has a distinctive call. It's that ticking, not the buzzing sound on the soundtrack there. They give little bursts of ticks. And I can hear that call when I'm driving 30 miles an hour in a car with the windows down. And I know that because I've heard it on the mainland. And I had never heard that call on the Vineyard in spite of driving around quite a bit at night with the windows open. So I'm pretty confident that it wasn't here, or if it was here, it was very, very rare. Until about 5 years ago, when we had Tropical Storm Jose, which was one of those tropical storms that stagnated and produced 3 days of very, very strong winds directly out of the north. And in the wake of Tropical Storm Jose, I heard this call in Oak Bluffs, and then the next night in Vineyard Haven. And I'm convinced that what happened was that a few individuals got blown here by those prolonged storm winds from a population on Cape Cod. The species now appears to be established, at least in Oak Bluffs. I've actually got it on my yard list now because I heard one there last year. So again, things are changing. You probably won't see, you'll see 50, hear 50 of these for every one you see. It is a treetop species, but listen for that tick, 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 tick call, because they're probably going to be expanding their coverage. We have lots of small katydids. Again, the shape of the ovipositor is a really critical thing. This is in the genus Conopcephalus. It's called the straight-lanced meadow katydid. It's pretty unmistakable because nothing else has an ovipositor device that the female uses to lay eggs. Very common species in particularly dry grassland habitats. And another very common species, this is Conopcephalus brevipennis, or the short-winged meadow katydid. Note that its wings are much longer than in this one, so go figure, the short-winged katydid has longer wings, but that's how it goes in the natural history world. This is a male, and just as the Melanopolis grasshoppers have a circus that the males have that is distinctive, it's the same thing with this genus of katydids. The shape and the coloration of these little prongers on the back end here are diagnostic. So that's what you want to get a picture of. And this is a male. Salt marsh meadow katydid, one of our katydids that has a very specific habitat association. They live in Spartina marsh. And this is what they look like. You'll never find it anywhere else. They're totally adapted to living in that very saline habitat. And this is actually in a different genus, Orchelamum. Again, you can see the cerci and how distinctive they are. Here they're sort of reddish, how that spur. These have kind of a cool song. Little bursts of sort of fluttery, twittery notes. And I haven't emphasized the calls of katydids very much because in spite of the size of these insects, their calls are generally pretty faint, and they all kind of sound alike, even to me after years of working on this. So they're not so helpful for identification. very soft, whispery calls in some cases that don't carry more than a few feet. But some of the other katydids have actually got pretty good songs, and I need to move things around so I can find the on button here. But you may need to turn your volume up for this guy. Okay, this is a common meadow katydid, Orchilum vulgare. It's a very common insect. You find it everywhere from row crops in farms to dry grassland. I videoed this one with my cell phone in the state forest. The males, which are the ones that call, tend to do this. They tend to hang upside down on a blade of a stem of little blue stem grass in this case. And if you're really careful and hear one calling, you can sometimes sneak up and get a look at them singing like I did here. Tick, 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 bzz, tick, 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 bzz, very distinctive call, and you will hear this all over the place. So I'll play it again because it's one you want to learn to recognize. All right, and the coneheads are another important group of katydids. They're called that because they have this little appendage at the front. We have 3 species, I think, possibly 4 on the Vineyard, and that cone is actually a really helpful ID cue. How long it is and how it's shaped and the coloration of its underside are the important characteristics. So if you can get a shot looking up at the face of these things, that's helpful. And the Orthoptera, the ovipositor is a helpful field mark. How long it is, whether it extends beyond the wings. And these mostly have continuous calls that are rather buzzy. And I will finish up. I think this is my last slide of insects, but I wanted to play this one for you because the robust conehead has a wonderful call, and you may want to turn your volume down for this one. An incredibly loud electric buzz, and you would not believe it's as loud as a cicada. When these fire up in our front yard and my wife is watching television, she gets up and shuts the windows because she can't hear the sound on the TV. Again, look how it's hanging upside down. This is actually big blue stem, but again, it's on a bunchgrass stem, and they just hang there and they call. And that's what they do to attract a mate. So a bone shaking, electric buzz, a really distinctive call. You will hear these occasionally on roadsides, but the habitat that they seem to turn up in most is actually in dune grass. You hear them in back dune habitats. And also sometimes in places like my front yard that have a lot of good clumps of bunchgrass. All right, so I want to finish up with a couple of resources. And again, this information will be up on our Atlas of Life website. But the singing insects of North America, you can Google that. You don't need to remember the URL or anything. Is a wonderful resource of all of the calling insects of North America with sound clips and range maps and drawings or photographs to help you identify. Bug Guide is a website that is useful for, I don't have time to go into it here, but if you're interested, let me know, shoot me an email, and I will set aside some time to show you how to use it. A couple of print field guides. This one is a wonderful little field guide, Guide to Night Singing Insects of the Northeast. It comes with a CD-ROM of, or actually just a CD, an audio CD of almost all of our calling Orthoptera, and I've learned a huge amount from it. The Magisterial North American Grasshoppers, Volumes 1 and Volumes 2. These are handbooks. They're expensive books and they're highly technical, but they are kind of the be all and end all, the final word in Orthoptera. He is working on volume 3, which is Melanopolis, basically the gene of the spur-throated grasshoppers. And then finally, I'd like to just thank some people who have been helpful to me as sort of mentors as I've been learning grasshoppers. People mostly on Facebook, actually, which, as absurd as it is, can be a really helpful resource for learning about insects. There are specialized groups for a lot of kinds of insects, and you get world-class experts participating regularly in them, and it's a great way to learn. In addition to cat videos, that's the best thing about this. So my email address, you're welcome to use that any old time. I welcome if you have questions about something you've seen, a photograph, that's great. If you want some suggestions for where to go looking for things, that's great. Again, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the State Forest headquarters if you want some practical field experience. And I guess I will just ask very quickly if anybody has any questions, just unmute yourself and fire away. I'll do my best to answer them really quickly. Anything at this point? Okay, email me if something occurs to you during your 2 o'clock in the morning bout of insomnia. I do hope you will pay some time, pay some attention to Orthoptera, even if it is at this point just going out at night and trying to tell how many different things are calling at a time. That's a great way to start. At this point, it won't be very many, but it will start to be more as the season gets a little bit deeper into August and September. When you're out in the field, shuffle your feet a little bit and see what jumps. Just start easy, and I appreciate your interest. I appreciate you taking the time to join me tonight and to stick through things. So best of luck with you, and I'm going to stop sharing. There we all are. And I guess that's it. We will be in touch with all of you soon, I'm sure, and thanks again for your time. Take care.
Thank you, Matt.